Hello there, and welcome to our first of two memory lectures for general psychology. I'm going to begin today's memory lecture with an activity that connects directly to memory, and I'm going to show you 10 words. I would like you to listen carefully to them. I would like you to look at them, but I would not like you to write them down. So please don't write these down. Just pay very careful attention. All right, and as usual, my equipment's not completely cooperating. There we go. All right, so again, on the next slide, you're going to see a series of words. I would like you to spend a few seconds to think about or guess the meaning of each word. A couple of the words are a little bit obscure, but you'll probably recognize all of them, and you might even know what they all mean. All right, here we go. A few seconds to think about the meaning of each word. Mammoth, Dumbo, pachyderm, that's pronounced pachyderm, tusk, ivory, trunk, Africa, circus, zoo, and finally mastodon, mastodon. So spend a couple of seconds. Hope you thought about all those words. And again, I hope you did not write them down, but we'll discuss this list later in this first lecture. All right, let's dive into the guts of the first lecture. The first lecture is based, like a lot of work in memory, by the very famous work of a guy named Hermann Ebbinghaus. He lived from 1850 to 1909. He was working at about this time that psychology was invented or discovered or founded, as some people put it, by his German colleague, Wilhelm Wundt. And honestly, I personally consider Ebbinghaus the true founder of psychology, in the sense that he used really careful empirical methods that have stood the test of time. But that's probably not fair to Wundt, because everybody else considers Wundt the founder of psychology. But we can say this much. Relative to Wundt, or anybody who lived in the 1800s, with the exception of William James, I think it's safe to say that Ebbinghaus had a powerful and lasting effect on the study of psychology, especially in his key area of memory. In fact, people still study lots of things to this day that Ebbinghaus discovered using his very careful studies and experiments a long time ago. That includes the spacing effect, that includes the forgetting curve, and it includes many, many other things. Let's just look at a couple of those really quickly here. They're pretty intuitive. The spacing effect, I've just illustrated it for you here with some hypothetical data. These are three people. I call them the tortoise, and then I call them hare 1 and hare 2. And if you look carefully at this little figure, there are a bunch of numbers there, but it's actually pretty simple. These are just 7 days of the week. So we go Monday through Sunday in a given week, and you can see that the person I've called hare 1 studied 7 hours on day 1, 7 hours on day 2, and took a 4-day break and only studied for 0.7 hours on day 7. You can assume this person took the exam on day 8, by the way. Okay, that's the hare 1. Hare 2 looks like did nothing for the first few days, studied 0.7 hours on day 4, studied 1 hour on day 6, and studied 13 hours on day 7. Okay, so this person is doing what you recognize as cramming. And then thirdly, we have the tortoise, who I've put here in blue, about 2 hours, in fact, exactly 2 hours every day for the first 6 days, and then 2.7 hours, a little bit of extra effort on day 7. Notice in this hypothetical example that each of those students studied exactly 14.7 hours. So unless I messed up my math, they all studied exactly 14.7 hours, which is not very much for a week, by the way, but maybe for one course that's familiar to you, that might be okay. But the question, of course, and Ebbinghaus would have given you a ready answer, is which of these students would we expect to do better on the exam? And I hope your intuitions are telling you what Ebbinghaus's very, very careful research showed quite clearly, which is the person who spaces out his or her studying about a couple of hours or 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day. If this is a really taxing course and you need 5 hours a day, you're way better off studying 5 hours every day or 11 hours every day than trying to pack that same number of hours into studying in 1 day, 2 days, or doing what we call cramming. So Ebbinghaus's work showed very clearly, and it's been replicated now hundreds of times, that the best way to study for something is to put in a bit of time every day, or a good bit of time every day if you really love something or you have the time, instead of doing things like we typically call cramming. Okay, that's pretty intuitive. This next one may not be quite as intuitive, at least you probably couldn't have predicted the exact shape of it, but Ebbinghaus also discovered what he called the forgetting curve, and I've given you one forgetting curve here that I borrowed off the web. It just shows over on the x-axis retention, how much information did people remember, and in this case it shows days since you first were exposed to the material. Now this could be minutes, it could be hours, it could be weeks in certain contexts, but the interesting thing about the forgetting curve is whether you're looking at minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, sometimes even years, you see a curve that looks very much like this. It's like a nice shallow ski slope for beginners like me. Can't really ski anymore with my knee, but if I could, I would rather go down that slope than down the crazy diamond slope. It's a nice even slope, but notice that forgetting happens pretty quickly at first. I'm pointing like you can see it, and then levels off. In fact, some forgetting curves, if you can follow this arrow, look more like this. They drop very quickly at first, then they level off, and then there's barely any drop off at all. So that particular forgetting curve is a pretty stable one, but you often see very rapid forgetting over the course of the first day, and then it levels out. So even in this curve, when you go from day 0 to day 1, you go from 100% memory to something like 70% memory. Then we go from 70 to about 50, and as you go from day 6 to day 7, though, you just go from something like 15% to something like 10%. So at first, the forgetting happens really quickly, but then there are certain things that you hold on to, maybe even forever. Now, there are other forgetting curves where you might hold on to half of what you learned. Every task is different, every time window is different, but you very consistently see a forgetting curve that looks very much like this one. Maybe a bit steeper the first minute or two, the first hour or two, but forgetting curves are predictable. And if you apply a forgetting curve to a classroom situation, I hope it's pretty clear that you're way better off asking a question during class when you just heard the material than you are waiting. Unless you make careful written notes, you're better off doing that than waiting a day or two or a week or two, at which point you may have forgotten so much that you can't even ask the question carefully anymore. So I dug into a bit of details there. In fact, I hadn't really done that when I've given this lecture before, but I want to dig a little bit more deeply than just saying spacing effect, forgetting curve. Even though I think you probably read about both of those, this is a very different way of representing it. So those are just two things. I should briefly mention that that's not all he did. He discovered dozens of cool, important principles. Two of the more famous ones that people still study now are primacy effects and recency effects, which I'm pretty sure you'll get to read about, or you already have. And also savings, which we will talk about either in this lecture, I forget, lecture memory, I still forget, or the next one. Okay, so probably this lecture. So Ebbinghaus made a lot of cool discoveries. Okay, the other cool thing about Ebbinghaus, if you're a psychology geek like me at least, is he came up with a really cool technique for studying things. But I have to say, even giving him credit, I have to admit that it would not have been very interesting to be in some of his studies, because he would have people study things for hours and hours sometimes. And he did this to himself as well, by the way. But people very rarely studied things that were meaningful. They very rarely studied music or art or pictures or even words. What Ebbinghaus did, his big discovery, which helped him make some of these cool basic science discoveries, was he made a list of 2,300 CVC trigrams. And CVC in English, now he did this in German, by the way, because he was German. CVC means consonant, vowel, consonant. And notice the word trigram means three. You also call them nonsense syllables, although a nonsense syllable could be a bit longer than a trigram. But if we stick to Ebbinghaus's paradigm, his approach, he came up with a gigantic list of 2,300 fake words, super short fake words, always three letters, always consonant, vowel, consonant. And if he came up with a word or a pseudo word here, a nonsense word, a trigram that turned out to be a real word, he dumped it out of his list. So he came up with a massive list of fake words. And the reason he went to all that trouble, and the reason he has people to try to remember words that weren't even real words, that were nonsense syllables, was he knew very well from his pilot work and his daily life that prior knowledge of a word, exposure to a word, interest in a word, experience with something has a massive effect on memory. And he controlled for that by getting rid of meaning. Now, there are other ways to fix that problem, but in Ebbinghaus's case, it was very clever. Again, not so great to be a participant in one of his studies, but a great way to get past meaning to bypass the problem of meaning by getting rid of all the meaning in his stimuli. Okay, so here's an example of that principle, and I'm going to share it with you before I show you anything. So in a second here, I'll show you what I'm about to tell you, but for right now, I'm going to say it very carefully. I have a fan going in the back, so it's probably a bit noisy here. I'm going to try to enunciate carefully, but I would like you to listen as carefully as you can to this little story or joke or whatever you want to call it. Listen very carefully. Un médico habla con su paciente. El médico: tengo noticias malas y noticias horribles. El paciente: bueno, dame las noticias malas primero. El médico: el laboratorio llamó con los resultados de su prueba. Dijeron que tienes 24 horas para vivir. El paciente: 24 horas, eso es terrible. ¿Qué podría ser peor? ¿Cuáles son las noticias horribles? El médico: bueno, he estado tratando de contactarte desde ayer. Okay, now you heard that, but of course you didn't see it. Now, if you were taking a Spanish 101 or 201 course, you'd probably get to see it while you heard it. You might even you'd love to have subtitles. I will give them to you. And of course, the minute I show you this, now you can see it. I hope it's much easier to process. You can read it. If you've taken a couple of Spanish classes now, you could probably start to figure out what it means. And of course, if you're fluent in Spanish, you have no trouble whatsoever. So if I'd asked you a minute ago, let me see if I can back up, to repeat that back word for word or tell the story again, and you could do that, that would tell me one of two things. Either you have a perfect phonological memory, which is incredibly rare, one person in a million or something insane like that, or you happen to speak Spanish. So if you speak fluent Spanish, with apologies for my sometimes imperfect pronunciation, if you speak perfect Spanish, fluent Spanish, you'd have no difficulty with the story. You could tell it back, and you wouldn't have to have a perfect phonological memory. So again, to repeat myself a bit here, if you completely remember what I said and you can repeat it back, it's very unlikely you have a tape recorder up in your head someplace. It's much more likely that you speak Spanish pretty well. And because that had meaning to you if you speak Spanish well, and some meaning to you if you speak Spanish just okay, which is all that I can do, by the way, and some days better than others, then if it has meaning to you, you remember it pretty well. Okay, let me give it to you in English. I hope it'll have meaning to all of you. I'm not going to bother to read it because you can read more quickly than I can speak, but I try to do a more or less literal translation. I even consulted with a friend of mine who's fluent in Spanish, and she said it was okay. So I hope you have the same story here in English. Okay. Okay, that's bad. It's horrible. Yeah, what could be worse? That's terrible. What's the horrible? If that's bad, if that's the bad news, what's the horrible news? Well, yeah, I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Okay, so it's a bit, it's a corny, very old joke apparently. But now if I read that to you out loud, or you read it and I asked you to tell that silly joke to your, cousin who likes jokes, you could probably repeat the joke pretty well because now it has meaning to you. And if you needed a few minutes to study, you could practically remember it word for word because now for you it has meaning. Now remember, for Ebbinghaus, this was a bit of a problem because if he gave people a list of 20 words, and some people happen to be connected to those words, the word shepherd, and I have a German shepherd, the word is pie, and I cook pies for a living, the fact that some people would have a deep connection to some words and not others was a big source of noise. So he wanted to equate all words for meaning, make all the words equal in meaning. He found the easy way to do that, the easiest way, give each word no meaning. Now that's not quite as easy as it sounds, but if we get back to Ebbinghaus's paradigm here, let me show you what he tried to do, and let's explore it a little bit. So here we see in English, now remember, I'm making this up in English. Ebbinghaus did it in German. I bet one or two of these CBC trigrams might be a real word. I didn't put them in my Scrabble dictionary, but I'm assuming they're not. So if we assume that these are not real words, they're trigrams. Notice we always have consonant, vowel, consonant every time. Consonant, vowel, consonant every time. And Ebbinghaus did the very same thing. Notice, again, if I found out one of these was a real word, I would look them all up in the dictionary to be sure. I would dump it from my list in case a wug is a real thing. I don't want a real thing. I want a completely meaningless, nonsense syllable. I want a trigram. Okay? Now let's compare learning that list of 12 nonsense syllables, those 12 trigrams, with what it would be like to do something that's just like it to a computer, equal amounts of information, but does have meaning. Look at these, the real words here in this list of 12. And I'm guessing if I told you, you have to learn a list of 12 things very quickly. You got 3 minutes. Would you rather study the list on the left or would you rather study the list on the right? I would be shocked if anyone picked the list on the left unless they were just trying to show off, because that list does not have meaning and the list on the right does. Now, again, to a computer, to a typist who doesn't care about meaning, those are all 3-letter words. In fact, they even resemble each other a bit. But the list on the right would be much, much easier to remember because each of those words has meaning. In fact, if you wanted to make them more meaningful, you could tell a story about those words and it would greatly speed up your learning. So for example, if you're a memory athlete or a memory expert, you'd probably say, okay, here it is. I'm in New York City. I get out of a cab. And there's a pig and a fox standing hand in hand. They have a little kid with them. It's literally a kid, like a billy goat kid. There's a rip in his pants and his little billy goat tail is wagging out the back end. You would continue that story until somebody went to bed and there was a dot and something red and you lugged something. And pretty quickly, you could repeat those 12 words, maybe even in order, by giving meaning, extra meaning to that list of words. So to summarize one of Ebbinghaus's biggest insights in a nutshell, he knew that meaning matters a lot, but he often tried to sidestep it by getting rid of meaning. We're not always going to do that. Sometimes we will. All right. We already said that, so let's move on here. Now notice, by the way, the Ebbinghaus version on the left was really hard, but it could have been even harder. I'll show you how. If you look at 13 things rather than 12 here, slightly longer list, of course, notice that we don't have trigrams anymore, at least not always. In fact, are any of those. Only one of those, as I glance at that list, I think only one of them is a trigram, and it's number 12. All the others are, vowel. Some of them are all consonant. They don't have that many vowels. They don't follow that rule. They're even less meaningful, but it's very easy for me, and if we were in class now, I would show off a little bit and I would do it for you. But if you want me to, I promise I'm not going to cheat. I will very quickly rattle off that list for you. And now, unfortunately, I don't have anyone to tell me if I made a mistake, but I'll check it myself later. So I'm going to cover my eyes. I promise I'm not looking. I'm going to tell you that in that list, in order, it starts with JLJ, SCH, WCP, MDJ, JHP, SHOGLS, followed by WSP, followed by RLK, followed by MGL, followed by JLP, followed by BOP, followed by RNA. I promise I didn't cheat. And when I get to do this, you can already tell I love to show off. when I get to do it in class, many students are pretty impressed. Some think I'm cheating. I turn my back to the board or the screen. I'm not cheating. Well, at least I'm not cheating the way you might think I'm cheating. The only sense in which I'm cheating is I'm using a list of letters here that do have meaning to me, and I've organized them. So a very difficult list for a stranger, but a very meaningful list to me. Again, if I made a mistake, I misspoke, hope I did pretty well. I will tell you why that was so easy for me. Those are people in my life that I dearly love. Most of them are passed away now because they're grandparents and aunts and uncles, but I focus mostly on my dad's side of the family. If I go through the list quickly, that's my mother's father. We called him Pawpaw, J.L. Johnson. Sybil Cooper Howard, my dad's mother, my grandmother. Then 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all the kids in my dad's family in order of age from oldest to youngest. So WCP is William Clayton Pelham, for example, and GLS is Gary Lewis Smith, for example. Then if you look at 8 through 13, those are my 6 siblings in order of age, roughly, beginning with William Stacy Pelham, Art, Rhonda Lynn Keith, Melanie Gwen Landers, and so forth, until we make our way to the end of the list. So it looks like I have a great memory. I have a great memory for things that I myself organize, and organization gives meaning, and I have a great memory for those things if I got it right or I came pretty close, because all of those people have tremendous meaning to me, and I put them in order myself. So if you make something meaningful when you study it, that's a good way to study and learn well. All right. Now, modern memory researchers don't want to bore people to tears. They occasionally do studies where they do things called implicit memory studies, and they're very, very painful to be in. They go on a long time. So not many people do that. What they're much more likely to do these days in memory research is to manipulate meaning in some nice, clean, clear way. And that's what we're going to look at here. We're going to look at judging versus counting. Now, both of those have some meaning, but we'll compare them later. We're going to see right now if judging something or counting something, both of which have some meaning, is a better way to learn 12 real words. Or is it 10? Yeah, 12 real words. On the next slide, you're going to see 12 words. Okay, well, a slide or two you are. If you were born in January through June, the first 6 months of the year, you're going to decide whether each word describes you. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. You're going to privately say to yourself, yes, that describes me. In fact, you can say, wow, it describes me really well, or it describes me pretty well. So yes or no, does that personality trait describe you? So I'll give you a word that's not in the list. The word might be greedy. Greedy, as in you've got to have money. I would say in my case, I hope I'm not greedy. So my private answer would be greedy, no. Okay, so you're going to do that 12 times. If you were born July through December, the second half of the year, you're going to carefully count the number of vowels. You got to look at the word, what's a vowel? You can count Y or W however you want to. Count the vowels in each word, again, without saying anything out loud, although we don't have an audience, as I often do, but still you should do it quietly to yourself. Okay, so here's the list, January to June. Does it describe you? Yes or no, and if yes, how well? July through December, how many vowels are in each specific word? And to be sure you have time to do it, I'll do one of them with you. But you're going to have to go quickly. Go. All right, now I'm going to do it both ways. You should only do it one way. Okay, that was kind of quick. If you didn't finish, that's okay. It's totally fine if you didn't finish. My guess is those of you who judge the words for whether that describes you all finished. Some of you who are very carefully counting the vowels may not have finished. If you didn't, that's totally okay. All right, now I hope you have something to write with you, and I can't give you any handouts because I'm not in the room with you, thankfully, because we have to all stay safe. But if you number a piece of paper from 1 through 5, and I'd like you to do that if you don't mind, and list the 5 U.S. states in ranked order that you would most enjoy visiting if the COVID did not exist and costs were not an issue. So free vacation, airfare, hotel, food, entertainment expenses for any state you want to visit. List the states or their abbreviations that you would most like to visit in order. I'll give you a minute to do that, and then I'll show you my answers. What 5 states would you most like to visit? Okay, it's okay if you didn't finish. It's totally fine. I'll show you my answers, and you may disagree. But if it were up to me, and again, if COVID were no issue, money were no issue, I would go to Hawaii because I haven't been there in about 20 years and I loved it. I'd go to California because I lived there for 10 years and I loved it. I'd go to Florida because I lived there for about 1.5 years and I loved it. I've only been to Washington State once, would love to go back, and I've never been to Alaska, and I'd especially love to go in the summer. Even the winter would be okay as long as I had good clothing. So those are 5 places I would love to go and visit if I could. Maybe I'll get to Alaska someday. All right, so that's an activity. Now that activity, by the way, was just a distraction. Okay, I ate up about a minute or two of your life to distract you. And what I want you to do now is see if you can recall, if you can remember the 12 personality trait terms that you just thought about a couple of minutes ago. So on that same sheet of paper, write them down. Of course, order would be incredibly difficult, but write down all of the words that you can recall, all the words that you can freely remember, and I'll give you a minute to do that. It takes about 10 more seconds. Try to come up with 1 or 2 more if you can. And we're going to keep it moving at a pretty quick pace here. Ideally, I might give you a little bit more time, but I'm going to say stop. So I wrote down 8 of them. Maybe you get more, maybe you get less. Now, of course, I've seen them before, so it's not fair. But I did put myself in a difficult condition today, by the way. We'll get back to that in a minute. That was your first activity. Write down all the words you can freely recall. Notice I put the word recall here in bold. That's a technical term in memory research. A recall measure gives you no clues whatsoever. You might see a list numbered 1 to 12 if there are 12 things to remember. You might be told that you studied 8 things, 10 things, 50 things, but you get no clues whatsoever. That's free recall. That's a very common indicator of memory. I say, hey, what's the capital of Alabama? I say, roughly how long is the Nile River? I say, I ask you any question and I don't give you multiple choice. I don't give you anything but the question. Then you have to answer. That's free recall. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I hope you consider this a bit of a favor. I'm going to give you not a recall measure, but a recognition measure of memory. And what I've done for you here is I've numbered the pages. You can see 1 to 12. And in this case, I put the correct answers in order with 3 distractors in each case. So number 1, number 2, all the way to number 12. In each case there, the right answer appears in that list of 4 words, and you just have to pick it out. So I'm going to do this one myself to be sure you have time. I hope you think this is much easier. It's why a multiple choice test is easier than an essay test, but I'm going to do this one very quickly with you. And when I'm done, I hope you'll be done. Let's see. I'm just writing down the one word that I think was in the list. Now, I did make this list, but I've not looked at it. I very quickly zipped through this lecture before I began. I haven't looked at it really in about 3 or 4 months since I taught in the spring, so it's been a while. But of course, I made the list, so it's not fair. Okay, I got to stop distracting. Let me let you work. almost done. All right, I finished, and if I finished, I hope you did. So notice what I gave you there was not a recall measure, but a recognition measure. That's much easier, but it's still pretty rare for a person to get all 12 of them, especially a person who did the activity the way I just did the activity. Okay, now before we do another activity, I ask you, yes, it's a distraction, but please do it for me. I would like you to list the 5 U.S. states that you would least want to visit. Even though it's free, even though the airfare is covered, even though you have some food bills paid, one of the 5 states that you really would not be that excited to visit. Do that very quickly. All right, I'm rushing you a little bit, but we're going to keep moving here. I'm going to show you the correct answers, of course, and of course here they are very quickly. We can argue this if we were present with each other, but the correct answers, of course, are New Jersey, Northern New Jersey, Southern New Jersey, Jersey, and of course Jersey Shore. And yes, I'm making a bit of a stupid joke there. My wife is from New Jersey. In fact, I took my daughter or I tried to yesterday, and I do actually love New Jersey. It's a beautiful state, especially in the South. But I go to New Jersey a lot. I don't need New Jersey as a vacation right now because I've been there at least 50 times in my life. Maybe it feels like more than that. Who knows? But I've been to New Jersey a lot, maybe 100 times. At any rate, that's a bit of a joke. That's a distraction. I distracted you because now we're going to do a third activity, very different activity. That activity is called a word fragment or word completion measure. What I want you to do now is work through this list very quickly. Write down the whole word. Finish each of those partial, incomplete, fragmented words as quickly as you possibly can by just making the first word that comes to mind. And I'll do it with you very quickly. Yeah, I'll zip through that one that I wrote in a sloppy fashion, so I'll give you another 10 seconds or so. Again, the way to do this one is the first word that comes to mind, period. And I hope you finished, because I did. Again, I made the first word that came to mind, and I found, even though I didn't mean to, in this case here, in almost every case, I could tell, and I tried to just keep following the rules, the instructions, I kept finding myself making the words that were from that list. Now, if this were an actual memory study, I would go to great lengths to convince you that this activity had nothing to do with the memory activity. I'd have a person in a different color lab coat come in and say that she's doing work in psycholinguistics and you think you're done with the other study. But what you would see in this study here, because it'd be a study of implicit memory, is the fact that you were just exposed to those 12 words, let's say 30 minutes ago, for you it's more like 12 minutes ago, would impact your performance on this word completion, word fragment measure, and you would tend to make a lot of these words that you normally would not have made. So the word easygoing is, just one possible answer for number 9. I think the word easygoing was on the list. And if it was, it makes it a lot more likely that you'd make the word easygoing instead of easel or easement or Easter or whatever else you might make in that case. So this indicates here a third way to measure memory, and most people would refer to this measure, if done properly, as an implicit, an indirect, a sneaky, an unconscious measure of memory. All right? Notice I already said that, but I'll repeat myself a bit here. Recall, recognition, and word completion tests are 3 very different ways to measure memory. And just to give you an indicator of how different they are, recognition memory is way better than recall memory for most people. And so that's why most students prefer multiple choice quizzes over essay quizzes, unless they've really got the material down perfect. And a word completion task is even more subtle, more indirect. You will often see that people who can't remember anything consciously, not just recall, I can't even recognize these words anymore, that they were on the list. You will still very often see that those words pop out on the word completion measure, not every time, of course, but at a much higher rate than they did if people had not studied that list and had studied a different list. So those are three very different ways to measure memory. And there's a lot of debate right now in the memory literature about whether there really are 3 or 4 or multiple different kinds of memory, or whether those different ways of measuring just pull out the same memories in different ways. There's a big debate about that. But most people would say, at least for our purposes, for practical purposes, there is such a thing as an implicit memory that you can't consciously conjure up, and an explicit memory that you can easily recall and talk about and dredge up without even that much effort most of the time. Okay, so that's that. Memory does behave very differently depending on how you measure it. We do have both implicit and explicit memories. And again, the experts will debate how they're represented in the brain, but everyone says, yes, I can give you an implicit measure, and it's different than an explicit measure. So if you'll do this for me very quickly here, very quickly if you don't mind, I'm going to show you one more word fragment, a piece of a word. I think I'm going to show you 3 letters at the beginning of a word. Very, very quickly, please. Maybe even say it out loud to yourself quickly, just like that. Make the first word that comes to mind. On your mark, get set, go. All right, you should have said it or written it down by now. Again, that's first word that comes to mind. And I'm guessing that for a bunch of you, you made the word elephant. Now, the word elephant is a pretty common word, but there are lots and lots and lots of other words you could have made. So you could have made elegant, you could have made elevator, elected, election, electricity, electromyogram. That's a pretty weird. Now, but if you work at a hospital where you work in the imaging department, I think it would be, and you take electromyograms, you might have made that word. But I'm guessing that, again, because I activated a word for you, I'm going to estimate that to be about 35 minutes ago. Yeah, 38 minutes ago, 37 minutes ago. Then that word popped out for most of you. The word popped out because you were exposed not to that word. I was very careful not to put the word elephant in the list. But if you think back to that list and I ask you to think about its meaning, there were lots of cousins of the word elephant. So the word mammoth, the word pachyderm, the word mastodon, the word ivory, the word tusk, the word Africa, the word circus, the word zoo. As you can see, almost all of them come to mind for me. Those were all elephant-related words. They activated the concept of the elephant, and that meant that you were much more likely than you would have been otherwise to make the word elephant. Okay, so that is another indicator of implicit or indirect memory. Okay. Let's go back to your second list, if you don't mind. I'm going to make this somewhat easier on you than it could be. If you go back to your second list, that recognition list, let's score your recognition memory. Those are the answers. I'm going to check I don't think I got them all. I think I got 11 of them, but let me double check and see. Yes, I mean, I made the darn list and I missed number, let's see, I missed number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I missed number 6. I put gullible instead of flexible. And part of the reason why, besides having an aging brain, is the fact that I did the activity not by thinking about whether the words describe me, but I counted the vowels. But we'll get to that in just a second. So I hope you scored yours. I quickly scored mine. I only got 11 out of 12. A little bit disappointed in myself, but I think I know why. I'm guessing, though, if you look at your own performance, if you had great difficulty with this activity, even the recognition measure, you were probably in the condition that I was in. And of course, you didn't make up the list, so you didn't have an advantage. If you counted the vowels, let's see, cautious, A, U, I, O, U, that's 5 vowels. If you did that activity, which does require you to think pretty hard, that didn't help you very much because that's not very meaningful. It's more meaningful than nothing, but it's much less meaningful than thinking about whether the word describes you and your personality. That's deeply meaningful to most people. Okay, we'll come back to that in a little bit. But for right now, I'd be shocked, and I've done this demonstration in groups of 20 to 35 students many times. I've never had a group of students who didn't do better in the does it describe me condition than in the count the vowels condition, because the does it describe me condition is deeply meaningful. Okay, the term for that, by the way, and I'm pretty sure it's also in your book, so I'll go quickly here, is the self-referent memory effect. The fact that we have superior memory for things that we relate to the self. Okay? How well does the finding that memory is better when something has meaning, does that fit the rule? Yeah, how well does that finding fit the rule that memory is better when something has meaning? I looked at that sentence and it didn't have meaning to me at first, but it does. I hope you can answer that question for yourself, and I hope the answer is pretty well, but I'd like you to think about the details of exactly how and why that's the case, and I believe that gets us to the point now that we'll take our break. Let's make sure I'm remembering correctly. Yes, end of memory lecture 1. I'll take a break here and start to post this, and you'll hear from me pretty soon, I hope, with memory lecture 2. Thank you. Goodbye. Hope you enjoyed it.